Hey team, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. Back today with some content around budgeting for legacy decks and how to get into a deck like Green-White Depths if you're on a budget. Green-White Depths is a pretty awesome deck because it does appeal to a variety of players. You might be a player who enjoys creature strategies and fair strategies. You might enjoy combo decks. And Green-White Depths gives you access to really all of those strategies, which is really nice. This is a deck that currently has been doing pretty well online. It's got a few finishes in challenges, which is really nice. And it's just a really consistent deck, which is pretty cool. So obviously this deck revolves around Thespian Stage and Dark Depths. Unlike the versions you might see with Black and Vampire Hexmage, Thespian Stage and taking the counters manually off Dark Depths are really the only ways we can create a 2020 in Green-White Depths. But what you lose in speed, I guess, in that way to getting to the 2020, you do have a mid-range plan, which is really nice. So by adding white into the deck instead of black, you get access to cards like another Reliquary, which really give you just another way to win the game through combat damage. Knight, of course, also really nice in this deck as a way to tutor for lands. Specifically some of your silver bullet lands when you really need them. Something like Bojuka Bog against graveyard decks, maybe Caracas against an opposing legendary creature, or obviously going for the combo. You also have a smaller version of Knight in Elvish Reclaimer, which again can just win games on its own, which is really nice. Some decks in Legacy do fold to cards like Bojuka Bog or Caracas, or even Wasteland to some extent. So these creatures that are also crop rotation effects can be really nice, especially in game one where your opponent might not have access to removal for creatures like Reclaimer and Knight. The other big card that has been printed recently in Modern Horizons 2 and it's given this deck a lot of power and a lot of speed, especially before when we were kind of looking at Green-Black Depths and Green-White Depths and how Green-Black Depths is a little bit faster. Yavimaya does give this deck the ability to combo off as early as turn 2 with the Mox Diamond builds, or in this version as early as turn 3, which is kind of nice. It also means that your mana is a little bit better, and I do say a little bit, but it actually makes it a lot better. It means that all your lands tap for green, which is superb. It means that Dark Depths now taps for mana. It means you can tap Canopy without actually losing life, which is relevant in matchups like Delver. And it also means you can keep a hand where you might have some awkward sort of plane starts, but something like Plains in Yavimaya is really nice to make sure that even you have double green on turn 2 if needed. So the big change here from a budget perspective is there's no Mox Diamonds in the decks. Mox Diamond is obviously a pretty expensive card. It is on the reserve list, and you probably will see it in a lot of the top performing versions of Green-White Depths. But I do believe that there are competitive versions of Depths that don't play Mox, which is really nice because usually with a budget, you're taking a cut on price, but you're probably also taking a cut on competitiveness in most instances. But I think with Green-White Depths, it's not as big as you might think, because this deck just has some really nice interaction with a lot of the decks in the format. There aren't too many matchups that get worse because you aren't playing the Mox Diamonds and have that acceleration, which is kind of nice. So I thought first up would look at some of the different decks that you'd see online. So here we have probably the most expensive version of the deck that's playing both Mox Diamond and also Tabernacle in the sideboard, which is going to set you back a little bit of cash here. But this is probably one of the strongest versions of the deck. I wouldn't say Tabernacle is necessary like it is in a deck like Legacy Lands, where the deck is played very differently without Tabernacle. You could play something like Glacial Chasm in the sideboard instead of Tabernacle, which I think does have similar effects, and is also nowhere near the price of Tabernacle, which is nice. Nice work too to this player getting second place in the Legacy Challenge, going 6-0, which is pretty sweet in July. Next, we have Mapson, big fan of Michael. He and Billy run the Dark Depths podcast, which if you haven't checked out, should definitely check out. They do a lot of content for Legacy and Modern, but also Mapson is just a massive fan of Depths decks and does really well with them. Here we can see he got a 6th place at the Legacy Challenge. So looking at the price difference, we lost about 6k by taking out the Tabernacle, and we can see here we have Glacial Chasm in the sideboard, which is nice. But again, 3 Mox Diamonds. Some players might say, hey, why are there only 3 Mox Diamonds? Isn't that a card that you want to see in your opener and have 4 of? But I think Greenwhite Depths is just a deck that doesn't really need Mox Diamond as much as other decks like, say, 4-color Loam or the faster versions of Depths. So I think you're happy just to have Mox, but you don't really need it because you have other things to be doing anyway on turns 1, 2, and 3. You have Elvish Reclaimer as a 1-drop, you have Sylvan Library to come up, and I think that 3 is a nice amount because it is obviously 1, card disadvantage, and 2, most of the time, a terrible top deck. So 3 is nice, especially from a budget reason. You don't need to get the full play set, so that's a small win. And then we have this version. So we're under $2,000 here, which is pretty nice when you go from, just under 10 to just under 2. So cutting nearly 80% of the cost, which is pretty sweet. And this is the version here. I actually have a video already with the deck on my YouTube. You can check that out. I'll put it in the description. But I think that this is a great place to start for Greenwhite Depths. If you're coming into the deck from a budget perspective, or maybe you're coming over from Maverick and have some of the cards already and just want to finish, getting the actual combo Dark Depths and Thespian Stage or some other pieces. So let's go through it. So without the Mox Diamonds, we replace those with Giver of Runes, which is a pretty nice 1-drop in this deck. Giver of Runes is really nice because it gives protection from a color until choice of turn, just like Mother of Runes, but it also gives protection from colorless, which is pretty huge for a deck that runs Dark Depths and tries to win through a legendary land, because Karakas, being a land, is a colorless source. So Giver of Runes can give protection to your Marit Lage in response to a Karakas bounce, in response to a Maze of Ith activation. Funnily enough, it can save your Dryad Arbor from a wasteland, which is pretty cool. It also means if you have like a Phyrexian Revoker attacking you or a Thought-Knot Seer, you can also give your creatures protection from that as well, which is kind of cool. Giver of Runes is pretty nice as well as a 1-2. It doesn't die to Plague Engineer. Giver of Runes saw a lot of play in the deck during the Run in 6 era, where it wasn't hit by the Neg-1 effect, and it also gave protection, which is really nice. Tomic was another card you might have seen in Depths back then, but hasn't really kept up with the format. But I think in this version, Give is a pretty fantastic choice. It's just another 1-drop, and just another way to protect your spells or your creatures, which is great. I'm playing 1 Prismatic Ending in the main deck for removal. So 4 swords is pretty customary. There are some situations where it's a little bit awkward to put your opponent above the 20 life, but I think in a build like this, you do have multiple ways to deal damage. So it's not like your opponent is once they're at 21, they're always at 21. I think that there is cases where you're probably attacking with her Elvish Reclaimer, or even a Giver of Runes if there's no other creatures in play. So usually the upside of swords removing a threatening creature is a lot better than the downside of your opponent being above 20 life. Prismatic Ending just really nice as kind of a 5th swords, because it deals with anything from a Ramunap, a Ragavan to a Delver, and then scales up as your mana goes. This is a 2-color deck, but we do have Bojuka Bog as a black source, and we do have Thespian Stage, which can copy opposing lands and give us access to an extra color. But if it's really not relevant in game 1, it's a pretty easy cut, which is pretty nice. So that's kind of the removal package. We also have Knight of Autumn as a Green Sun's target. Green Sun's really nice as well in this deck because, again, it allows us to scale from 1 mana. It's a mana accelerant for Dryad Arbor, and then you can go from anything for protection in Sylvan Safekeeper. You can go for Ramunap, which allows you to turn on your graveyard as a resource and start getting some advantage that way. Obviously, Endurance is fantastic as well as a graveyard piece. And just a 3-4 blocker with Reaches is huge against Delver. And then of course you have your knights and your reclaimers, which is really nice. So Sylvan Safekeeper on top of the Giver is really nice, because Safekeeper probably a little bit harder to interact with, especially in the late game. It's not really the protection spell you want in the early game, just because you don't really want to be trading away your lands so early on. But sacking lands is pretty relevant as well, not just the ability to give your creatures Shroud. It also means you can instantly make your knights really big. You can make Reclaimer a 3/4. You can do some pretty cool things. A little like kind of cool thing is like you can, if you have like a Paducah Bog or Karakas in play and you want to get extra activations, you can sack those to a creature to give it Shroud and then replay them with Ramunap to then get like a second activation of Karakas or an extra ETB of Paducah Bog, which is kind of cool. We were playing a 5 split of protection. I was playing the full 4 givers and 1 Sylvan Safekeeper, but we only played 1 step because of that. And in the league that I played, there were a lot of times where I had a step in hand, being the only step in the deck, and I just wanted a second one. I really wanted a second one at instant speed for crop rotation, reclaim, or knight. So I've gone back to playing 2 step and dropping down the giver to just the 3. Step really nice, especially in this deck. Giving yourself access to protection from instant speed spells, or even just clearing the path if your opponent is tapped out with like an Endurance or an Ice Fang in play. Give pro green and swing through. What else? We are still playing the 3 Savannas, which is probably the most expensive part of the deck, being the 3 jewels. But you could, in this version, because we are playing on a bit of a budget, we are playing some extra lands like Horizon Canopy, and a main deck Field of the Dead, which is kind of another way to win. A fantastic card in the grindy matchups, but not so great in the games that are going to be over in the first few turns. But I do like the thought of having this main deck. I would say it's probably more of a sideboard card, but it can just win games, so I'm not too unhappy with it. And because of the field, if you really were on a budget, you could trade the 3rd Savannah for a Temple Garden, because there is some synergy with Field of the Dead, which is quite nice. The 2 life can definitely matter, but I think if you're on a budget, then that's just something you got to take. So definitely keep that in mind if you only have like 2 Savannas and you want to know what else you can do. Sylvan Library really nice. Sylvan Library really nice in the Mox Diamond decks, because you can play it turn 1 and then recoup from your card loss from the Mox Diamond. As I said before, Mox Diamond is of course card disadvantage, and unlike decks that play cards like Duck Confidant, you don't have a quick way of regaining that card advantage unless you play something like a turn 1 Sylvan Library or play Ramunap later in the game and start getting some lands back. So I still think Sylvan Library is really nice here. It's also just a piece that can go on the board that's a little bit harder for your opponent to deal with. Unfortunately, a lot of the blue decks now have Prismatic Ending, which is a fantastic answer to Sylvan Library, especially in game 1. So it's not as safe as it used to be. So I'm usually pretty aggressive with these, especially once you know that your opponent is on a deck that doesn't have a clock. Paying 8 straight away feels really good, especially if your opponent's going to 1-for-1 with the library. Already having those cards back is a pretty nice feat. What else? What else we got? I think this, is pretty solid. The other thing you could do if you were looking for another jewel is maybe playing another basic, which doesn't sound great. You could also go with another fetch land, I guess. Maybe something like a Misty Rainforest, because then you might be able to kind of, not really show that you're on a fair deck. I think Windswept Heath is probably the most fair fetch in Legacy. So playing Windswept Heath Pass sometimes gives away that you're just on some sort of creature-based deck. But Misty Pass definitely gives away a lot less. So say if you go Misty Pass and your opponent combos off, then they might figure that you're on some sort of blue deck, which is kind of nice come sideboarding. So that's something definitely to consider. An extra fetch. A fetch always nice with Sylvan Library, with Reclaimer to build it, with Knight to build it. And also just a way to get Dryad Arbor if needed in response to like a sack effect or something. To the board, we have 3 Deafening Silence. You could play Thalia as well. Some lists play like a split of 2 Deafening Silence, 2 Thalia. The reason that I like Deafening Silence is that it's turn 1 interaction. I think this deck, especially with cards like Gaddock Teeg and Collector Oof, do have multiple ways to interact with combo on turn 2. But I think it's a case for this sort of deck to actually get to turn 2 which sounds pretty easy, but there are a lot of decks right now that can combo off turn 1 or set up themselves so that once it gets to turn 2, they're ready to answer something and go off. So Deafening Silence, really important, and probably, I would say, the best printing for fair white legacy decks in the past 5 years. It's just insane how good this card is at not winning you the game, but setting up a speed bump against combo decks so you can then set up further disruption that then wins you the game. And that's all you want. You just want time. You want time against combo, and that's exactly what Deafening Silence does. So against things like Tess or Ant, of course, against any decks like Ruby Storm, Urza's Saga, Urza Echo, it's pretty fantastic. Even against a deck like Show and Tell, it can be okay. It's going to be a case of Deafening Silence just being better than a card like Swords to Plowshares. So Deafening Silence I really like because it is a 1 CMC play against combo. Thalia nice because it can come in against a deck like Delver as well. It also applies pressure, so it's a mix of both pressure and disruption. If you saw my deck tech on building Legacy Maverick, you'd know that I'm a huge fan of having a good mix of both disruption, pressure, and then also disruptive pressuring pieces like Thalia. You might see Deafening Silence and say, hey, why aren't you playing Aethersworn Canonist? Because that is disruption and pressure. And again, the big reason is that I don't think I have the luxury of waiting till turn 2 to play it. I really want that silence, which does come at a cost. You know, Aethersworn Canonist also great against a deck like Elves, which I think that Depths already has a good time against, especially with the Mox Diamond builds, because it can just combo faster. But in this build, it might be a case of looking at some of the matchups where the lack of Mox Diamonds does make some sort of combo decks a little bit harder to navigate through because you are that turn slower in most cases. That a card like Aethersworn Canonist might have to be there. But it's definitely a consideration just to look at and see how you feel with your local metagame, or if you're playing online, what sort of decks you're playing against. Do you have the luxury of waiting, or do you think you need the Deafening Silences? Speaking of combo, we do have Gaddock Teeg as well. I really like Teeg and Oof because they come in against different things. Oof really good against combo, but also decks like Stoneblade decks or Death and Taxes. And then Teeg relevant against anything from Storm decks to Elves, which is great, turning off their own Green Sun Zeniths and Natural Orders, which is pretty huge. It's also quite good against the Bant decks, where they are playing Prismatic Ending, Entrant Explosives perhaps, Terminus, Supreme Verdict, Jace, Force of Will. Just a really, really disruptive threat, which is really nice. Just be prepared for opposing Karakas, but in this deck, we obviously have Give Runes, which is kind of nice, so that can definitely catch your opponent if they're not too sure what Give Runes actually does. But yeah, I think the split here is really nice because with the Green Sun Zenith package, you obviously, once bought it into Teeg or Oof, have virtually 5 copies of them, which is really powerful. And why I like a split of these 2 creatures over, 2 more Thalias or 2 more Canonists. For extra graveyard hate, we just have 2 Endurance. The reason for this is it is a Green Sun's target, which is fantastic for the late game, but it's also just a really versatile card. It's great against combo decks that play that interact with the graveyard. It's great against Delver, which is fantastic, and it's also not that bad against control, as just a end of turn flash effect to keep the pressure going. And as a 3/4 creature, it's definitely one that has to be answered at some point before you can just take over the game with dealing with a bunch of creatures dealing damage, which is kind of cool. But I have seen Surgical, I have seen Leyline. I really like Endurance because it just has that flexibility, and I think for a fair deck that isn't playing any sort of library manipulation other than Library and Green Suns, we're not playing Brainstorm, not playing Ponder or Preordain, having flexible sideboard slots is really nice, and Endurance is exactly that. Force of Vigor. Force of Vigor is probably my favorite card against any sort of artifact enchantment decks. It means we can tap out as a fair green deck and still have some sort of interaction up. It's really nice against some of the Pithing Needle decks, the library decks. Of course, it's really good against... I like it against Death and Taxes as just a nice way to deal with their equipment packages or Aether Vials. And yeah, just a really nice card that this deck doesn't have a hard time hard casting either, which is pretty good. And I think against some of the unfair decks like Urza Echo, it's fantastic because it allows us to not allow them to be too unfair in the early game if we can force some things at the right time. Choke. Choke is obviously there for the blue decks. I don't mind it against Delver on the play, but you do have to look out for the new versions of Delver that play a lot of cheap threats, because it could be a case of you just playing Choke on turn 3 and tapping out and losing. So be wary of when you play Choke, and also just be wary of new cards like Prismatic Ending or something like a Teferi Bounce. Blue decks do have a lot more answers to Choke, especially the ones playing white, so the 3 is really nice to make sure that not only are we seeing them, but we're getting multiples into play. Part to Exile on the board, a really nice extra card that just really hits everything. Although it does give our opponents an extra mana, especially in the early game, I think usually it's a case of the threat of the creature is worse for us than them having additional mana. So something like Ragavan, obviously Path also hitting cards like Murktide Regent is fantastic, opposing Marit Lages, which is awesome because it means they don't gain the life, so we can keep pressuring with our creatures. Just overall a really nice removal spell. And then Glacial Chasm might be an interesting one. You might say, hey, what's that for? It's really for the go wide decks. Decks like Hogak, the new Madness decks, it's pretty good against. I don't mind against Elves. I don't mind it against Death and Taxes, but it's obviously going to be a little bit tougher against the creature-based decks like Goblins and D&T that are playing Wasteland. But Chasm, just a nice way to buy some time, set up the combo, and then upkeep, just let it go to the bin and attack for lethal. So Chasm, really cool. That's pretty much it. Some advice for new players. The Green Sun Zenith has a primer on the Greenwide Depths deck, so definitely check that out. There's a lot of good content as well on YouTube. I do a bit of content, but there's also maps and plays. I know that Jarvis and Don Harvey have gone through some leagues with Greenwide Depths. There is a lot of good YouTube content, so definitely check that out. If you have any questions about the deck, leave a comment. Let me know. I'll be happy to know what you're playing. If you're trying out any new cards, if you think there's some further budget options you could do with this deck, because $2,000 is still very expensive for a Magic deck, but for Legacy and for a competitive Legacy event, Legacy deck, it's not too bad. But I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you like the format, if I can improve on anything. But until then, enjoy yourselves. Cheers.